Hello, and welcome to this podcast, which has been produced to accompany By Jove Theatre Company's new recording of Here She Comes, an epic poem written and performed by S.J. Brady with music by Vivian Yule. My name's Christine Plasto.
My name's David Bullen.
And we're going to talk a little bit about some of the background to Here She Comes, particularly about the Bacchae by Euripides, the original Greek tragedy that Here She Comes is an adaptation of. Some of the ancient religious cult behind that, and also some of the poetic forms that have influenced S.J. Brady's writing. So, David, the Bacchae by Euripides is a Greek tragedy about the women of Thebes leaving the city and going into the woods to worship the god Dionysus. Maybe you could tell me a little bit more about the cult of Dionysus in ancient Greece.
Yeah, sure. I'm really glad that when you summarized Bacchae there, you said it's about the women of Thebes leaving the city and going and cavorting on Mount Kithaeron, because that is absolutely what the play is about. But much more often, you get people summarizing this play as it's about Dionysus, who is this god, obviously this god of wine, of ecstasy, of theatre in Athens, at least. And a variety of other things, fertility. He has a range of different resonances, like all the kind of Greek gods. He kind of collects different resonances over time. And he is quite extraordinarily the center of this play, at least on a kind of a character-based reading. He starts the play by saying, I've returned home. I returned home. I was born here in Thebes. His mother was Semele, a princess of Thebes, the daughter of Cadmus. His father, of course, is Zeus. And they have a disastrous courtship whereby Semele sleeps with Zeus. Zeus, disguised, of course. Zeus manages to get into her bed by saying, I'll give you anything you want. One thing. And Semele says afterwards, perhaps tricked by Zeus's wife Hera, she says, show me your true form. And of course, Zeus's true form is a red hot lightning bolt. So she is burned alive, but the infant, the fetal Dionysus, is inside her. He is snatched up, possibly by Zeus, possibly by Hermes, Zeus's other son, or one of his other sons. And he is then put into Zeus's thigh, bizarrely, sewn up into it with golden pins, and brought to term in Zeus's thigh, after which he's born and then raised in the East, what the Greeks considered the East. And at the beginning of Bacchae, we get this interesting description of Dionysus's journey around the East, where he talks about going to Arabia and Lydia and all sorts of places, some of which we recognize now, some of which are kind of no longer kind of relevant names in quite the same way. And then he's now returned home to announce his divinity to Thebes and to all of the Greek city-states.
So what makes Dionysus distinctive amongst the other ancient Greek gods?
That's a really interesting question, and lots of scholars have thought endlessly about that, actually, and as have ancient sources as well. So first of all, there's this really interesting quality to Dionysus, that he's half god, half mortal. Much like many characters in Greek myth. But why is he a god rather than others? That's a very interesting question. He seems to always be conceptualized in Greek culture as the god that comes from far away, that comes from the outside and has invaded Greece in some way. But we know that he is among the oldest of the Greek gods within actually the kind of Greek religious system, because his name is attested to in the Linear B tablets, these really old Mycenaean tablets, that culture kind of predates the ancient Greece that we kind of often talk about and know about. So he's really present from the beginning. He's half god, half mortal, which I think in some ways makes him distinguishes him from obviously the fully divine Zeus and Apollo and Hermes and Hera. I think also something interesting about him is that he seems to combine masculine and feminine elements in a really interesting way. So he has these two birth stories. He's born from Semele, then he's born again from Zeus. He is described certainly in the 5th century and certainly in Bacchae as effeminate, as womanish, woman-like, as a kind of slight boy. He's not always been described like that. Actually, prior to the 5th century, he's often depicted with a beard. But it's interesting that he sort of begins to kind of take on these kind of qualities. But I think that perhaps the most important distinguishing feature of Dionysus is that the way you worship him, which is the monadic way, you worship him in a kind of in a present way. He comes to you. He's not present in a cult statue, though sometimes he is, depending on which cult you're talking about. But he enters you. He becomes part of the dancing group of maenads that are worshipping him at any given moment. Or indeed, if you're Athenian, you might also believe that he enters you whilst you're performing on the stage, because he's the god of the mask, the theatrical mask as well. You might think that in some ways his power enters you when you take on a character.
That's really interesting, especially that Athenian context that you talked about there at the end, because of course this original play, the Bacchae, would have originally been performed at the city Dionysia in Athens, which was the annual festival of theatre that took place in the theatre of Dionysus. So even there you can clearly see that Dionysus is a figure who's at the centre of Athenian life. And while we might not in the modern world think of a theatrical festival as, you know, a really important thing, either in religion or in civic life, for the Athenians it was both an act of worshipping Dionysus through performing theatrical spectacles that were sacred to him, but also a really important aspect of Athenian civic identity and their kind of political goals. It's often said that the Athenians devoted as much money to the theatre as they devoted to the military, which, whether it's true or not at different points in history, it's interesting to consider the weight that gives to this collective religious theatrical act that took place regularly, sort of right in the heart of the city. And it suggested that all citizens were expected to attend the theatre. Again, this isn't something we can guarantee, and particularly we don't know whether women were allowed to attend, which obviously adds interesting resonances to this play that's so focused on a collective group of women leaving the city.
Yeah, and that's really interesting, particularly about the absence or presence of women in the theatre and how they receive this play, because I think something interesting that Euripides seems to be doing with the play is particularly with this off-stage, on-stage chorus. Obviously, on stage, the maenads there are embodied by young Athenian men, you know, teenagers, or slightly older than that. So they're dressed as women, they're performing women, and so the Athenians view them in this kind of constructed way. You know, there's a kind of awareness. Okay, you're not a woman, but you know, and so the kind of the kind of threat of the maenad that women might band together and do destructive things if left unattended is a little bit negated on stage. But what's really interesting with this offstage chorus and these two extraordinary messenger speeches Euripides has in the play, describing the kind of peaceful and violent actions of the maenads, I wonder if for the Athenian men sitting in the audience, they're thinking, what happens when I'm here and when we're engaged in civic life away from women and they're all together? What are they doing? What do they get up to? Are they capable of this sort of thing? And of course, there are other women-only festivals in Athens as well that they must be thinking, what's going on? You know?
Yeah. And we know that they were thinking that when we look at something like Aristophanes' Thesmophoria Zeusae, the women at the Thesmophoria, which is a comic play that is exploring exactly that question. What are women getting up to when they're going off to this all-women religious festival, in this case in honor of Demeter? It's interesting that these women-only groups are often tied to these deities who have some connection to concepts of fertility or sexuality in some way. And so I think that the Athenian men were certainly, it was on their minds what women might do if they all got together and went off by themselves and had a bit of space to maybe plot and plan and do something shocking.
Mm. And what's so interesting about that play is that Euripides is a character. And
exactly.
And he's a character, and the kind of plot of that play is remarkably similar to what happens in Bacchae in many ways, written long before Bacchae. But there's a kind of thread of thinking that perhaps Bacchae is Euripides' kind of response to that play. He thinks, how can I rewrite a myth that kind of sends up in a kind of tragic mode that what happens in that play, that what happens to men who go and spy on the women festivals, who are trying to infiltrate those, and he puts it in a kind of tragic key. I'm not entirely sure if that's I don't quite believe that Euripides is 100% just trying to kind of writing a whole play just in revenge against Aristophanes, though I admire that kind of level of pettiness. But I think it's an interesting, at least to think that there is this kind of resonance here that he's trying to play with, the idea of men disguising themselves as women in order to get a glimpse into what's hidden from men, and that very little in ancient Athens is hidden from the eyes of men. They have they build themselves in a right to everything. So yeah, this is an interesting kind of little wrinkle.
So you say that the Maenads are actually the characters who are at the center of this play. Can you tell me a little bit more about those two groups of Maenads?
So in the play, really interestingly, there are two groups of Maenads, an on-stage group and an off-stage group. Maenads and that word literally means maddened one, maddened woman, mad woman, in the sense that they are driven out of their minds in the kind of ecstatic cult worship of Dionysus, and that's the way you worship Dionysus. You run around on a mountainside, perhaps drinking copious amounts of wine, perhaps not, and something about the wild dancing and the running and maybe the mountain air produces an ecstatic effect that the group then kind of perhaps merge with or understand Dionysus to have joined with them or entered into them in some kind of way. And there are two groups of these people in the play. We've got the onstage chorus of Maenads who've followed this priest of Dionysus, who of course they don't realize is actually Dionysus because he's disguised at the beginning of the play. But they think he's a priest, and they followed him all the way around Asia, and they have arrived now in Thebes with him. So they're kind of his hardcore followers, and they're the on-stage Maenads. And then we have the offstage Maenads, which are the women of Thebes that Dionysus tells us right at the beginning of the play. He's stung to madness is the English phrase that's often used in translations. He's stung them to madness and sent them leaving their homes to dance and cavort on Mount Catharon. But what's really interesting about this, and it's really clear in the text, is that they have left their domestic lives in Thebes, these women. Obviously, the women of the chorus have long ago left their domestic lives to follow Dionysus. But here, there's this real pointed comment in the play about they have left their homes, they've left the loom, is the thing that is often mentioned, and they've abandoned their houses, and they're going to form this new community up on Mount Catharon, totally away from the eyes and control of men.
It's interesting that we've been talking a lot about these collective groups of women, the Maenads, both on and off stage. And obviously in performance, we would have this group of performers on stage in the form of the chorus. But in S.J. Brady's Here She Comes, in fact, we only have one performer on stage. And I think that's to do with the fact that Brady isn't necessarily mimicking the tragic form. She's using the tragic play as her source material. But in terms of the form that she's evoking from the ancient world, it's actually much closer to epic poetry, the genre of Homer, the Iliad and the Odyssey, where you have a large scale story stretching across time and space, but that's just told by one performer. Of course, in the ancient context, epic poetry was defined particularly by its meter. It was performed in dactylic hexameter, which is the specific poetic meter of epic poetry, and which can be detected in the ancient Greek of the Iliad and the Odyssey, as well as other works. But in the modern sense, I think epic is often used to evoke these stories that are grand in scale, and which often deal with kind of grand ideas like fate and whether people actually have control over their lives, what it means to be liberated. And so it's interesting to think of taking a tragic story, and I mean tragic in the genre sense, in terms of tragedy as a performed mode in the ancient world, taking that narrative and transferring it to the epic mode with a single performer, and in this case, a single female performer, which is really powerful. As we know, the majority of our surviving poets in all forms from the ancient world are male. Certainly all of our surviving epic poets and tragic poets are male. So I think there's something quite powerful about seeing a female writer and performer performing from memory in that kind of inheritance of the ancient epic poets, a story that really puts women at the center. And of course, the woman who's really at the center of everything is Agave.
Yeah, absolutely. Which I think is really interesting, given the fact that really there is not much written about Agave beyond kind of just her name appearing in lists prior to Bacchae. I don't necessarily think that Euripides invented her as a character. As I said, she has a kind of identity as one of the daughters of Cadmus, as indeed the mother of Pentheus. And of course, the story of Dionysus and Pentheus's clash that is dramatized in Bacchae was a very popular one on the Athenian stage. Lots of other people wrote tragedies based on it. Aeschylus wrote a version that is now only surviving in fragments. In fact, he wrote this lovely, I think would be lovely, trilogy of plays, one about Semele. This is a very potential reconstruction. There's lots of room for error, but scholars, the popular view is that one of the plays was about Semele, Dionysus' mother, and indeed about the birth of Dionysus. Another play in this trilogy was about Actaeon, who's Pentheus' and Dionysus' cousin, who similarly kind of gets torn apart on Mount Kithairon, but this time by the hunting dogs of his own hunting dogs after he's turned into a deer by Artemis. And then the third play was more or less the same narrative as Bacchae, but in that version, supposedly, what happens is that Pentheus leads an army of men out to fight an army of Maenads, and they kind of die in this kind of militaristic clash. But that, of course, that's not how it goes down in Bacchae. And there's evidence to suggest that, yeah, Euripides is kind of inventing the role Agave plays in this tragic narrative in a major new way. So it's interesting then that SJ has kind of like taken Agave, who doesn't get much. She really appears only in the kind of the last half hour of Bacchae. She's talked about a lot, but she only appears on stage in the last half hour of Bacchae, and she's broadly there just to be condemned for murdering Pentheus. And she SJ's kind of taken her out and then excavated her and then fleshed out her life to give it that kind of epic scope. And I think what's really interesting is that, epic is, at least the ones we have, broadly focused on men and male narratives. The Odyssey is about Odysseus's great journey. The Iliad is full, really, of men and male perspectives. And yes, we get some little flashes of female perspective in the Iliad and the Odyssey and other epic poems. But really, here she comes. It's all about Agave's perspective, her life before, her life after this moment, and the kind of the moments leading up to it as well, which is really interesting.
Yeah, that's really fascinating to think how SJ's poem gives Agave this kind of mythic cycle of her own rather than making her just a flash in somebody else's mythic cycle. You know, you get this sense that she has a life that extends beyond both ends of this story, that she's been living a life up to this point and she will continue to live a life after it. In the same way that you get a sense of that from a character like Achilles in the Iliad, although you're seeing this heightened snapshot of an important moment in his life. We don't even see the death of Achilles in the Iliad. So, you get these really interesting moments, and it's kind of a similar thing that happens in tragedy. You get these heightened moments, but that epic form really allows you to embed that heightened moment in a person's story into this longer mythic narrative and really show how a character's life isn't just defined by these crazy, tragic moments, these things that they do, but that a life is something that spans birth to death, and the story can span that time as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's something really interesting about doing that for Agave, because we think of a lot of the other characters from Greek tragedy, female characters from Greek tragedy, that are fascinating and dynamic in all the kinds of ways. Medea and Clytemnestra and Phaedra, and Antigone. They have a range of other myths around them that even if you even they're being adapted in any given tragedy for just one episode in their life, we have a kind of greater sense already of what happens to, say, Medea before and after the Euripides play, to what happens to Clytemnestra before and after the plays in which she appears. Particularly Clytemnestra has that kind of, she invites that kind of epic length already. But Agave doesn't have any of that. So SJ has kind of given her a life out of this, extracted her and kind of spun her whole new narrative. And I think there's something very interesting there about epic being the form for that, not just for all the reasons we've already talked about, but the fact that there's a kind of a contemporary trend in the last, say, 30, 40, 50 years, really quite recent, to use epic as a form to kind of give voice to marginalized figures, figures who don't normally get to speak in the big stories, the grand stories. Here She Comes is not just about Agave in that sense. It's about a woman who has experienced extreme marginalization within her own life. She's totally repressed by her overbearing son, and it's kind of hinted at a kind of a quite overbearing husband who's now seems to be dead, and it's about what happens when that repression sits on you for years and years and years and years, and then the kind of violence that erupts out of it, and I think it's fascinating that SJ has kind of threaded Agave's story through with this very contemporary, very relevant resonance about the life of repressed women.
It's fascinating to think about how SJ's poem explores these issues of, a repressed woman or repressed women. We can assume that maybe Agave's story is representative of the stories of a lot of those women in that group of Maenads, that they're all kind of responding to the same stimuli. And I think that one of the things that's really fascinating about the story, both in SJ's version and in the original, is that the women are offered liberation when they head off with Dionysus. And I think it's a reminder that, for me, that story is always a reminder that what looks like liberation or freedom might not necessarily be that in practice. That we should interrogate these kinds of offers of, I don't know, a magic bullet to fix all of your problems. This wonderful person is going to take you away from it all and take you off to do things his way. Well, ultimately, is his way better than what was going on before? I don't think that. I think it's a reminder that our liberation has to come from ourselves, that it has to come from within. We have to liberate ourselves. We cannot be liberated by a figure like Dionysus, particularly, a figure like Dionysus, for all that he may be subversive and fluid in his presentation and fluid in his divine role. Ultimately, he is a divine figure. And in the ancient Greek context, that's an extremely patriarchal thing. They are a group of extremely powerful beings who have ultimate control over what humans do. So by going off with Dionysus, the Maenads aren't really escaping from a patriarchal system. They're just moving into a different part of the same patriarchal system. So yeah, I like to think of this story as a way of reminding ourselves that when we want to be liberated as groups of women, perhaps we just have to rely on being a group of women for that. We don't need a male figurehead. We can just be a group of women and be liberated as that group or as individuals and set ourselves free rather than being set free by this supposed liberator who's actually just giving us a new form of oppression.
Totally, I completely agree that, and I think what's really interesting is that this poem exists in a kind of history, a recent history, but a history nonetheless, of women who have looked to the Maenad to explore exactly the kind of themes that you're raising here about the possibilities and limitations of liberation. And even though the Maenad is so often reduced to a simple archetype of the woman who's out of her mind and therefore easily dismissed in a lot of analyses, I think these people like SJ and other artists before her demonstrate that there is a complexity to the Maenad, a thematic complexity that is interesting to explore and relevant to explore, relevant to women's lives and men's lives, to be honest, now.
Thanks very much for listening to this podcast. We hope you found it interesting and informative. If you'd like to find out more about By Jove, you can visit our website at byjovetheatre.org. You can visit our Patreon page, patreon.com/byjove, to become a supporter of the company. And if you haven't already, you should now visit our YouTube or our SoundCloud page to listen to Here She Comes, performed and written by S.J. Brady, with music by Vivian Yule. Thanks for listening.